Good morning, everyone. My name is Joseph Dresden, and I'm the Senior Program Associate at the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you all for joining us today to hear our panelists present their research findings on the dynamics of wartime attitudes and identity in frontline Ukrainian cities. Before we begin, I would encourage you to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, which are Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, and our new Russian language blog, In Other Words. You can also find and subscribe to our podcast, Kennan X, and the Russia File. All of these you can find on the Kennan Institute website. Also, visit our Hindsight Upfront Ukraine collection at the Wilson website for latest news and analysis focused on Ukraine. To our virtual audience today, please, if you have questions for our speakers, you can submit them via the QA function on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation when sending your question. I begin today by introducing both of our speakers and will allow them to describe their research findings before we turn to the discussion period. First, we have Karina Korostelina. Dr. Korostelina is a professor and director of the program on history, memory, and conflict at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University. Her most recent book, Neighborhood Resilience and Urban Conflict, the Four Loops Model, explores the resilience in urban neighborhoods affected by chronic conflict and violence and developing a new model for improving resilience policies. She's also a former regional exchange scholar with the Kennan Institute. Also with us today is Garrett Toll. Dr. Toll is a political geographer and founding figure in the creation of critical geopolitics. He is a professor of government and international affairs at Virginia Tech in Arlington and is the recipient of multiple research grants from the U.S. National Science Foundation. His latest book, Near Abroad, Putin, the West, and the Contest for Ukraine and the Caucasus, won the International Studies Association EMNIA Distinguished Book Award in 2019. And he's currently completing a book manuscript titled Oceans Rise, Empires Fall, How Geopolitics Hastens Climate Change. And I don't think that is such a wrap, but you can correct me if I'm wrong there, Dr. Toll. I will now turn the floor over to Dr. Korostelina, and we look forward to your comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me share screen. Okay, everyone can see it?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you for inviting us. We're always happy to come back to Kennan and present results. In fall, we presented results of our very first round of research from National Science Foundation, and which was conducted in July 2022. Continuous guiding questions which we had presented here, and we were able to conduct another round of interviews and survey in April with the same group of people. The survey we conducted was the same. I will speak more about it. So our major questions which were posed by this research: how do frontline Ukrainians who exposed to war-related violence think about war, ceasefire, negotiation, and call for peace? How they understand their identity and their relations to Russia? How they think about their territory and various regions? And what are differences? How frontline Ukrainians reason about wartime dilemmas and trade-offs? So our survey sites were the same during the first and second wave. We conducted research in Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, and Poltava. As you see, our first round was conducted in July 2022. The survey was administered by Kyiv International Institute of Sociology. We had over 1,800 respondents from the same group, the same panel. We interviewed using the phone survey in April 500 people. So you see this representation also, which also was across these three sites. This is big table, just if it will be questions, sample representation, pretty equal by age, by everything else. The only thing, as you understand, in Ukraine, women prevailed, it was 57% of women. So first topic will go is changing between me and Gerard. So identity and social boundaries are our first topic. And this result, then we ask people, what does it mean for you to be Ukrainian? Because we know that the Ukrainian identity really skyrocketed. A lot of people connect themselves to Ukraine, show loyalty to Ukraine. So, but what does it mean for them? So in 2022, we asked this question, and we saw that civic meaning of national identity, identification with Ukrainian as citizen prevailed. Did it change in 2023? So in 2023, we actually asked four questions. We asked, to be a good citizen in Ukraine means speaking Ukrainian language. And you see this particular graph, which show very different representation and belief in this. And we ask, it's rejecting Soviet history and memory, especially when we ask them in the light of a new law in Ukraine. Again, we see, because mostly of our participants are living in Eastern Ukraine, there are some people who still disagree with Soviet, with complete denial of Soviet history, because of course they were studying and by using Soviet textbooks, and history is a belief among these people. And we had a very great set of publication at Canon Institute about the age difference, and this mostly older people who represented here. But what's the most important for us, and we ask them if doesn't mean respecting different culture and ethnicities and be independent of ethnicity, language, and culture. Here we get the highest results. So people see Ukrainian national identity not as Ukrainian based on ethnic identity or language. They really see it as a representation of citizenship independent of their region. So it become really European, more and more become more European liberal meaning of national identity rather than primordialist 19th century position of national identity. So here you see this representation in a better way. So you see how civic and multicultural meaning of identity prevail among citizens. We also look at dynamics of European and Russian cultural identity. We clearly see this is 22-23, we clearly see race in European identity, it's rising, and we also see that Russian cultural identity become less important among people, but I will speak more about it in the very end a little bit, how people clearly distinguish. And we actually measured how people see differences with Russia and Ukraine. It's very strong, and the most important and moral boundary seeing Russian people as less moral, as non-human in some instances, much stronger than now as war progresses. So Ukrainians considered better people than Russians, and this is a moral boundary really closing. Also, we saw how people see the threat coming from Russia to their economic and financial welfare. And here we see interesting tendency of normalization of the war. Actually, as war progresses, people see Russia as less threat to the economic financial welfare, because in the beginning, of course, it was a shock. It was a perception of growing threat to them, and the war progresses for many people it's become normal. And as in our interviews, we really see people tell, I'm not even going to shelter. I decided it's okay for me not to react. So this normalization is one of the factors we see there. Emotions very interesting in the way that while still there is very strong hatred and anger, but they a little bit decrease through the years. However, the feeling of fear increased, while only 35% expressed fear in July 22. In April 23, survey shows that fear was felt by 47%. We explored, is it the same perception of Russian leadership and Russian citizens? And you see here that hate toward Russian leadership is much stronger than toward Russian citizens. Similar picture we see about anger, and similar picture we see toward fear. So frontline Ukrainians clearly distinguish between leadership and Russian citizens there. How they see Ukraine itself, we see that pride toward Ukrainian military is very high. Everyone has a strong, very strong, absolute pride. However, we see less pride in Ukrainian leadership, and there are more discussion which come in interviews about some concerns, and also pride in Ukrainian citizen actually is even higher than in Ukrainian leadership. Meaning of the war, we also were asking how people see the war, what war means to them, because it's very hard to understand how war influences people's behavior. And in this way, we were really trying to dig deeper and understand the meaning. So one of the major hypotheses which we try to explore, which come from the literature, then people lost somebody. To deal with the loss of the person, they actually want more continue the war because sacrifices should be for some reason. And it's clearly coming in interviews, but also we see it in this survey. When we think about the loss of people I love and know, I believe critical to continue war until Ukraine wins. So this is the key. People prefer continue war rather than have a negotiation. Then we ask people, is it war have strategy for Ukraine and meaningless, or Ukraine fight for its freedom and for Europe? We clearly see that people see this war as fighting for freedom, for Europe, for position. It has a lot of meanings for people affected by war. And finally, we also put two separate questions to measure how belief in just war help people to believe in a victory and be more optimistic. Then we ask people how they're optimistic or pessimistic about the war. Oh, sorry. You see here, a lot of people are very pessimistic, but still we have people who less pessimistic, who a little bit pessimistic and so on. However, then we ask people, they confident that Ukraine will win because justice is on our side, then you see much stronger agreement. So we clearly see that people see this war as a just war and believe that the winning will come to Ukraine because justice should be addressed. So I give it to Gerard, and I will be happy to assist.
Great. So what I want to talk about are the dilemmas that we posed in the survey. And it really comes down to a very, very painful dilemma between lives and territory. We're framing this as really a study of sacred values, and sacred values are values and also places, territories that are beyond rational, instrumental cost-benefit calculations. So they are seen as transcendent features of a group, and they are generally insensitive to time and quantity, cost-benefit calculations. So notions of family, notions of land, nation, identity, honor, values, and way of life, all of these things are seen as non-negotiable. And if we go to the next slide, we had a very open-ended question in the survey in July 2022, which asked people to identify 4 things they believe are sacred in wartime Ukraine. The very first, it's extremely difficult to see. So the very first in that list is protecting family. So family and life is front and center, and it really shouldn't be a surprise. That is often that is the case. But quite close behind are sets of principles and values which are considered sacred too. So defending our land from invasion, the independence of Ukraine, Ukraine's territorial integrity, all of those are the ones that are circled there, which are really land and territory. And the smaller one, in case you're wondering about, is the right of people to return to their homes. Now, bear in mind that half of the sample are displaced persons, so it's not a surprise that that there is really central and sacred to them. So then let's look at how this plays itself out. We go to the next slide. So we asked about territorial indivisibility, and there's a large academic literature on the crucial significance of territorial integrity and visions of the territory of the nation as a sacred value. And this has to do with socialization into a sort of map logo, a vision of the territory as complete, of our state. And even if you're not living in this area, even if you're thousands and thousands of miles away in Western Ukraine, and you've never been to Crimea, yet you have grown up in an independent Ukraine, where Crimea is an integral part of an independent Ukraine. And so you have a desire, a commitment, you have a loyalty, this is what Ukraine is to you. And so then any kind of, and there's a literature on this too, any attempt to try to contest territory, to take off territory, is an affront to you, to your national identity. It makes it incomplete. It creates a cause, a sacred cause, which is to reclaim lost territories. So we asked about, we give a series of statements. We asked people whether they agreed or disagreed with these particular statements. So one of the ones we asked in 2022 was this one: an undivided national territory is an essential value of the Ukrainian nation. So you can see the strong agreement with this 75% plus. Now, it's not 100%, so that there also is an important finding. We asked it somewhat differently in 2023. All of Ukraine's national territory is sacred to me, whether people agreed or disagree with that. As you can see, again, strong, overwhelming, 3/4 of the population agreeing with that. And, you know, if you put the somewhat agree, then it goes up into the 80–90% range. So this is, we can say that territorial integrity is a sacred value in Ukraine. We're amongst this population that are frontline Ukrainians. So if we go to the next slide, then we ask the agreement or disagreement with a series of statements. And here what we're looking at is the degree to which when you put together life versus territory, what do people choose? And so we kind of test certain commonplaces that you sometimes hear in order to see what people, how do they sort this out. So we asked about a particular statement. We can be concerned with our lives and well-being, not questions of territory or geopolitics. And as you can see, there's a diversity of opinion about this. And we asked that again in 2023. What's important, I think, about 2023 is that there's increasingly, it's often difficult to kind of actively reject a particular statement. The sort of, there's an implicit bias, cognitive ease with saying, yes, you agree with it. So the pushback against it, strongly disagree, somewhat disagree, is, I think, significant, and that has gone up. Now, it's only a little bit, but I think it is kind of interesting, which means that the longer the war is going on, the more there is a commitment to territory. and the significance of territory is very salient. Okay, next. Now, here's a different framing and it gets to what Karina mentioned earlier about loss and meaning making. And so we ask about the responses to the question, to the statement, because of the sacrifice of Ukrainian soldiers during this war, so lives, but lives lost, it is important, more important than ever, that Ukraine never concede our territory to Russia. As you can see, just overwhelmingly strong agreement with this. And even again, 2023, there is, although the samples are not the same, but there is some evidence that this is increasing. So an important finding there. Okay, the next one. So then we front load a question which foregrounds, we prompt where we put the idea of the loss of so many people. And, you know, I realize this is a very painful dilemma for people, where we talk about the costs of the war, and therefore it's imperative to seek a ceasefire to stop Russians from killing Ukrainian men as the future of the nation. And so therefore, you know, that's a value. Again, there's a presumption, yes, you would agree with that. As you can see, there is some sort of divergent opinion. This is clearly a painful dilemma for people. But we can notice in 2023, somewhat counterintuitively to what I said earlier, is that there's the amount of those that strongly agree with this has gone up. So that also is an important thing to bear in mind. And then the next. So then we put these dilemmas together and we ask people what's more important, to save lives of Ukrainian soldiers and civilians, or continue the war to free all Ukrainian territories, including Crimea and the Donbass. We asked this in 2020-22, and there was a diversity of opinion. This is something that is quite divided. People are quite divided on this. We found that in 2022, displaced persons tended to be more on the save lives than free all Ukrainian territory, which was somewhat counterintuitive, because we thought people who had been displaced from certain territory would be very much invested in getting that territory back, but they also were exposed to the horrors of this particular war. As you can see in 2023, there is greater clustering on the both equally, and they're saving lives somewhat reduced. Freeing territory somewhat increased, but again, marginal in terms of its findings. Overall, what this question again underscores is just how difficult this dilemma is for people, and people come out on different sides of it. So we'll go to the next slide. So here we're going to just show you some slides on the geopolitics and the ceasefire. So here we take a commonplace and ask whether people have a sense of alienation from the conflict, and whether they see it as something that is way beyond their everyday life, and whether they have a sense that, you know, they are pawns in a much larger game. Now, this is a question that my colleagues and I have asked for a number of years in different locations: Transnistria, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, and elsewhere. What you can see here is that there tends to be mixed attitudes towards this, but the strongly agree has somewhat reduced, but it's more or less the same findings as we had before. And then the next. This is a new question which we asked in 2023, and we asked whether people were, you know, whether they had a cynical attitude towards Western powers providing aid only because Ukraine is fighting a war for them against Russia. And as you can see, there's a number of people that do are sort of persuaded by that particular logic. But there's also a number of people that are neither agree nor disagree with that sentiment. Okay, next. Then, are you happy with the level of international aid, military support being provided to Ukraine in this war? This is a new question from 2023, and as you can see, generally there is positive overall contentment with the level of international aid and support being provided to Ukraine. And then, yes, the question, how much do you support negotiations on a complete ceasefire? So this is a particular experiment that we ran in 2022 and we reran in 2023. And essentially an experiment has, it had three sort of exposure or three versions of the same question. One, which essentially asked people how much do they support negotiations and a complete ceasefire. The second version of it said, President Zelensky supports negotiations with Russia on a complete ceasefire. How much do you support that? And then the third one, the leaders of the EU and the US support negotiations with Russia on a complete ceasefire. How much do you support it? So it's testing the degree to which there is an endorsement effect. In other words, if you put Zelensky's name behind this particular sentiment, does it make a difference? If you put the EU and US leaders' name behind this sentiment, how much does it make a difference? And one of the key findings in 2022 is how much Zelensky's endorsement mattered. It really boosted those that totally supported the idea of negotiations. So if he puts his name behind it, it makes a difference. It moves the needle significantly. What we also found in 2022 was there was a backfire effect, and that if you talked about the EU and the US endorsing it, more people were tended to be in opposition, totally against negotiations. And there was, I think you have to attribute that to a certain degree of sentiment at the beginning of the war that the EU and the US wanted the war ended quickly and that they would, quote unquote, sell out Ukraine. Now, this is only one particular survey, 1,800 people in July of 2022, but it is nevertheless, an interesting finding. We asked it again, and what is very interesting, about less people, but very interesting, is that went away. No backfire effect. In fact, that when peace is endorsed by Zelensky, that increases it, but when it's endorsed by EU leaders, that also increases it. But note overall that the finding is that those that are totally against negotiations has gone up. And there is, even with the endorsement of Zelensky and the endorsement of EU leaders, there is a 25%, the 25%ers who are sort of irreconcilable to negotiations with Russia should that particular moment. And that's a significant finding, I think, and one that further researchers will have to come to terms with. There's a term for these in the sacred values literature. They're called devoted actors, and those that are absolutely committed to the restoring the territorial integrity of Ukraine, irrespective of what the larger leaders want. And that there is a factor that has to be in the minds of policymakers going forward, that there's a danger that this conflict can become intractable, and it has significant implications for peace too. Okay, then I believe I'm turning it back to you, Karina.
Yeah. So first of all, this really interesting result which we see, and we like, for example, we clearly see, as Gerald told, increased trust in foreign institutions in terms of being able to change opinion of people. So we conducted, I just told the beginning, 90 interviews. We just started its analysis. It takes long because we really coding them very vigorously. But I want to give you some preview of what's coming attraction, and we will be happy to speak more about it when we complete it. So I just will show 3 results. It's multiple results, but 3 to just go deeper into understanding. One of them is a language identity. And what we see from interviews that majority of our people interviewed, they all agreed that Ukrainian language should be state language. The language of communication on the state level, but however, they all also stated that it will be great to have opportunity for people to continue speaking languages which they used to have for different reasons. Some of them that it was widely spoken language which didn't have any connection to the loyalty to Russia. They show that it's Russian language is a cultural space rather than political space. They also stress that for many people, especially older generation, had to switch to Ukrainian language while they still trying their best. They all very proud to speak Ukrainian language at the state level. So it's really showing this dual model. A lot of them actually was very interested. A lot of people were citing, for example, the model in Canada and other places. And also, what coming up that even now with the situation with war coming, they feel pressure to speak, feel uniconization, which they believe there are conflicts, and they really see East-West conflict in Ukraine going right now with blaming Eastern Ukrainians from the West. A second group of finding is how the war will end, how people imagine the ending of the war. And again, it's several clusters of responses. Some of people speak about Russia-related factors, that Russia withdrawal, that so disintegration of Russia or more sanction of Russia will push Russia away. However, majority of people looking into victory, which clearly depends on support for Ukraine, international support for Ukraine, and considering different territories, they speaking about territorial 1991 or territorial 1992. How they produce negotiation? Some of them speaking about need for advantage. Ukrainian advantage before negotiation will start, and some speaking about stalemate, that it will be a moment when both states could not progress and will sit at a negotiation. What will be negotiation about? People speaking about ceasefire, many people speaking about multilateral negotiation where international organization will define agenda. Some speaking about third-party inclusion, especially about United States and European Union, but majority of people stress that it should be Ukrainian position and the core. Ukraine should decide what should be. Some believe that probably negotiation will be about some concessions made from both sides. And what the results of it, they speak about security for Ukraine, some people speaking about repatriation. And finally, very, very complex question, which we will continue to explore. It's what do territories will be, occupied territories will be freed and returned to Ukraine, how you integrate them. And here we see people realize so much complexities. First of all, we see people speaking about policies, about need for economic development. A lot of common in interviews, again, it's common interactions, but a lot of we listening from people who were on occupied territories and escaped what's going on there, and it's horrific picture. So people speak about winning hearts and minds of the people through economic policies as a part of it, giving people choice where they want to stay, return to Russia or be in Ukraine. discussion of autonomy, very important issues, and how to address misinformation and election. For common identities is very important. A lot of people tell we were really against these people who were on occupied territories of Donetsk and Crimea, but now we understand being on occupied territories ourselves, we understand this experiences, this pressure, this security issue. So, and a lot of people told we still have common identities. They're all Ukrainians. We want to stress it. As you see, everyone sees difficult process where it's easy. It's very hard to decide. It should be very, very tailored policies with care. People are stressing need to understand motivation of people who were there, and also a lot of people stressing need for psychological trauma and support. Everyone from our interviews was stressing stress that they experience a lot of emotional anxiety and depression and so on. And finally, there is a group which also speak about collaborators, that they should be brought to justice, and it needs to be talked to this particular group. So I will conclude here, stop sharing, and we will be happy to answer questions.
Okay, thank you, Gerarda and Irina. For those of you who have questions online, please use the Q&A function on the Zoom to submit them. But before we turn to those questions, I think my first question for you both, I noticed the one slide, which was conveniently sort of scrolled to point out the two spikes in preference, one for lives and one for territory. And I want to ask whether you think it might be possible that Ukrainians believe that controlling their territory is essential for their future security and hence lives. In other words, if you leave Russia with land, they'll just come back for more in the future. Do you think that's a potential explanation for that dilemma?
So I don't think that there is one Ukrainian attitude on that. Certainly, what you have just articulated is a commonplace in rhetoric about Russia and is justifiable. And I would add another dimension to it, which is the argument that Ukraine has moral obligation to those that are living under occupation to try to free them from that occupation because of the oppressions that are occurring there. And this is significant in the case of not simply the areas taken since February 24, 2022, but also the Donbass and also Crimea. And so that is a sentiment which foregrounds territory and people. It's a sort of biopolitical and geopolitical or geoterritorial conception. That's not the view of everyone. And I think that that's important to bear in mind, is that there's two things going on. You can have, at the one hand, a significant buy-in, 75%, 80%, the population buying into the idea that the territorial integrity of Ukraine is a sacred value. At the same time, you can ask that same population the degree to which they are willing to give up Crimea or Donbass in a negotiation. And what we found when we asked that question in 2022, we couldn't ask in 2023 because we didn't have a sufficient amount of time, is that there was more sentiment, not majority sentiment, minority sentiment, but more sentiment for concessions which would potentially lead to the loss of Crimea than there was relative to the Donbass and to any other areas. So people actually do differentiate, at least in what we see in the data, is that when it gets down to that issue, now it's still unpopular. It's still not majority sentiment, but there is differences. So the difference is a commitment to undivided territory, but a willingness to trade certain areas and differentiations between those in a minority sentiment.
Yeah, and I just want to add that, yes, they clearly differentiate, and it's clearly seen also from interviews, but also what, as Gerard told, there is no one prevailing narratives, how some sociologists or some bloggers trying to prevent all Ukraine think this way. No, it doesn't. No, there are competing narratives, competing views, as always. And like, we clearly see from interviews that people say that we sacrifice so many lives. How we can give up territory for this? People died for it. How we ready to? But there are other people who tell, no, we could not continue sacrificing lives, because who will be living on this territory? It's like a most true opposite views, but there are a lot of views in between on how counteroffensive, people really assessing counteroffensive, another in their views, and how life cost, how much cost for particular territory, how many lives would be sacrificed to it. So people think about it all the time, and it's extremely stressful for them. And it's created, that's why Gerard, how he showed there are increasing number of people who don't know actually in their land.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left in our discussion today, and I'm going to turn to the online questions. Ellen Whitedorn asks, did you look at gender differences in your questions on these issues of war and peace?
Yes, we actually did, and as always in wars, there are gender differences actually disappearing, because there is a belief that women more peaceful. Actually, what we found in many research pieces, women become even less peaceful and more demanding of change. So we didn't see significant statistical difference.
Okay. Beth,
could we have perhaps a few of them, Joe, together? If we had a few of them.
I'll ask the next two questions together.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Beth Mitchnick asked, what or how do you interpret the differences between IDPs and locals? Were you able to distinguish any statistical differences across or within places, or by origin or by current residence?
Yeah, we clearly see the statistical difference between IDPs and locals in support for peace. What we found in conducting we didn't present it here, but we also conducted the several more sophisticated statistical procedures, and what we found that people who lost home or lost property, mostly IDPs, they more in support for peace and more support for life, while what we found people who lost somebody, who lost close friends or family member, these people more support for war. So it's not linear connection between it, but there are clearly statistical difference. Gerard, do you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we should be, there's a danger, and I guess when we say support for peace, support for war, it's support for a ceasefire as opposed to support for fighting to continue on.
Okay. All right, I'm going to ask two questions together, so please let me get to the both. Robert Legvold asks, and my screen moved, is it fair to conclude that were an internationally monitored referendum held in these areas, the vote will be overwhelmingly for reunification with the remainder of Ukraine? The next question I will ask comes from former Kenneth scholar Mikhail Alexeyev. Do you see any statistically significant or substantively meaningful differences across the three cities on your key variables of interest? And as far as changes over time, did you get a chance to analyze if they're due to within or between subject differences? So two very different questions there.
So do you want to?
So I'll take the question on the vote, Robert's question. It depends on what areas we're talking about. If these particular areas that we're doing research in, I think there's no doubt that these areas would, they are part of Ukraine. They would, if there was a vote on where they should go, they would vote to be part of Ukraine. That is also the case, and I've done research with colleagues on the Donbass and elsewhere. That is true of all of the areas beyond February 24th that Russia has seized. Those areas overwhelmingly supportive of Ukraine. There was minority sentiment for any kind of relationship with Russia. Now, the Donbass that was occupied and Crimea are different. I don't know what sentiment is there right now. It's impossible to do research there. But I was involved in a research project just before the war broke out in the Donbass on both sides of the line, and there was certainly significant sentiment supportive of Russia, but not overwhelming. So maybe around 50% or so, but more support for actually a non-sacred value conception of the territory, which is, people didn't care what flag they lived under as long as they had a good job and a good pension, and we spoke about that. So that whether that has changed as a consequence of all of the horrors that have occurred over the last 16 months is an open question. I just don't know the answer to that.
And based on interviews which we have, so we clearly see that there are strong loyalty to Ukraine on the territories currently occupied. Also, there is a deep understanding among people who own these territories what's actually going on Donetsk, Lugansk, and Crimea with the pressure over Ukraine, with propaganda. They clearly understand it, and that's why they show that we need to win hearts and minds of people. We have to bring economic development to these regions instead of proposing pressure or something. So there's a clear understanding among Ukrainian people that even territories that occupied since 2014, many people still will be happy to be part of Ukraine because Ukraine provides much more freedom. There's every single person in interviews discussing freedom versus authoritarian regime, pressure versus this. So, and addressing the second question, we actually conducted latent analysis, and we define as a group 5 latent groups, and they were more connected to identity clusters rather than to particular territories. So we have 5 groups in our analysis, which mostly based on combination of connection to Russian culture, to Ukrainian national identity, so civic identity rather than region, but definitely not intersubject difference.
Hey, our next question comes from Michael Keyes, who's currently a scholar on loan from the State Department at the Kennan Institute, and he is curious whether you've compared the results that you have found with other conflicts, perhaps in Transnistria or perhaps outside of the region entirely in times of war. Do they sort of compare with other cities that are on the front line in various conflicts?
Actually, this is one I start here, so that the whole research, the whole National Science Foundation research came that me and Gerald were at one of the seminars and discussing experiences of other conflict dynamics. And the question, which is very not resolved, still have a lot of different positions and not consistent in literature, is how experience of war violence impacts support for ceasefire or support for continuous war. And in some countries and some research, we see that people exposed to violence more in support for ceasefire, while other research showing not the more support for the war. So actually our research here is strongly addressing this gap in the literature and trying to show more complexities within this relations between this dependent independent variable in this way. And also, I just completed analysis from the other project of 15 peace processes. Publication shall come shortly about it. But what I found, multiple interesting things, but one of the major findings that if you promote civic meaning of national identity, then you sustain peace process. If you promote ethnic exclusivist type of national identity, that peace process is in peril. So this is the one of the most important, which we also clearly see in our results.
Okay. Jared, any comments?
Well, what I would say is that there's nothing quite comparable to this in the other research that I have conducted, because this is still wartime. I have done research in Bosnia-Herzegovina. I wrote a book, co-wrote a book on Bosnia, and Bosnia is in pretty bad condition right now. And there was a lot of displacement and attitudes from May 1992 to December 1995. So that's quite a number of years of war. Very hardened attitudes, irreconcilable, extremely low interethnic trust. In Abkhazia and South Ossetia after the 2008 war, strongly irreconcilable attitudes, hostility to the possibility of return of people displaced from that area. Now, in the case of Abkhazia, they've been displaced for quite a while, but no sense that that there was justice, that people were displaced from their homes and had a right to reclaim those homes and the like. It was strongly irreconcilable attitudes. Violence polarizes and in that sense, it inflames and people become irreconcilable. And, we have to look at the fact that this war may be an intractable one, and that even if the guns fall silent, the attitudes will be intractable, and the possibility of bridging those is going to be extremely difficult.
Well, let me pick up on that, Garrett, because one of your slides seemed to indicate that on the issue of language, the issue of Russian versus Ukrainian is still perceived as more cultural than political. Do you think that might not be the case if the war continues much longer, or that, perhaps even Russian-speaking Ukrainians might be viewed with suspicion among their compatriots? Or do you think that the civic identity that's being forged, one that is sort of embraces a multicultural and civic nation, might be a bulwark against that sort of shifting sentiment against Russian language?
Yeah, that's a great question and a very important issue for the international community to be very aware of. I think that in that piece that we wrote, which is on the Kennan blog, you will see that what we see is in wartime situation, understandably, there's a strong reaction and a attitude towards differentiation from the enemy, a sort of a refusal of the enemy's language. So a lot more Ukrainians apologizing for speaking Russian and seeing Russian as problematic. And then, of course, Ukrainian speakers themselves potentially viewing those that are speaking Russian as second-class citizens or as not fully loyal. You have the issue with Pushkin statues and so on and so forth. There's a sort of desire for a cultural purification, a decolonization of Ukraine. And that is understandable in a wartime context, but it also has major implications for the peace, because the more ethnocratic Ukraine becomes, the more it is going to cause problems for the possibility of reconciliation, and for that, the more that sort of civic identity is going to come under pressure. And we in the international community need to be very mindful about that particular tendency and seek to counter program against that. And
also in our interviews, absolutely, just completely right. And what we also see in our interviews that everyone tell, I stopped listening to Russian media, I stopped listening to TVs, I stopped listening to Russian songs, but they also clearly distinguish between current Russian Federation and Russian cultural space as a language. They speak about Akhmatova, they speak about Tolstoy, they speak about cultural space which is not political to them. And while they all agree with Ukrainian is very important, exactly as Gerald told, there are a lot of people also speaking about this pressure of Ukrainization and being accused. So it's very, very important to develop inclusive national identity, inclusive meaning. And we're not speaking about only Russian, we know situation with Hungarian community and Romanian community. So it's very important to, as European identity raise in Ukraine, more connection seen of European, it should be liberal European space, inclusive, rather than, again, primordial ethnic conception.
I'm going to add to that cultural conversation with a question from Leonid Turkovich, who asks you whether there are any correlations with religious beliefs in your findings.
So I asked, one of the questions that was in the survey was about sacred values and religion. It's quite clear from the results of that people do not associate sacred values as coming from religion. There's a diversity of opinion on that. So there's not overwhelming sentiment. It is religious for some people, but for a lot of people, it's not. I also actually, Karina will remember this. We had a negotiation over, what question to ask, and we asked about the earth and the degree to which people saw the earth as sacred. And this is something that is, as a geographer, I'm extremely interested in, this whole question of ecocide and the way in which there's an ecological dimension to this war, which is really horrific and has obviously got global implications. A very strong sense, if you prompt people, strong belief that the earth is sacred. And so that's one of the things that we're going to do something with later. Just one last, sorry, go ahead, Karina.
I just wanted to one phrase that in Ukrainian identity, always earth connection to the land was one of the key meanings, rather than religious dimension.
Gary, you're going to say something additional?
Yeah, I was going to say just on the Russian language issue is that, of course, the one positive, it really just depends on the Russia that is left standing after this. But one positive is that there could be a different Russia and that Ukraine could be a sort of lever for the transformation of Russia in a positive way as a consequence of this war. Now, obviously one should not let one's hopes get away from one in this respect, but that possibility is there. It may take some time, but I think that is a way in which we can have a Russian culture and a Russian language, which is much more mindful of not only colonial past, but the particular crimes that have occurred in the conduct of this war.
We're about at the end of our time today, but I want to end on one question that is firmly in the minds of Western armchair strategists. And I'm going to paraphrase the question submitted by Jan Nens. And essentially it's, do you think the Ukrainian people would be satisfied with a conclusion to this war that leaves Donetsk, Luhansk in Ukrainian hands, but Crimea in Russia's hands?
So I think that there is a possibility that would be acceptable if the major authorities come down in favor of that and sell it. But I think that there will be an irreconcilable group that will not accept that, and the degree to which they are organized and have capacity to demonstrate their irreconcilability. And civil wars after conflicts, it happened in Ireland, where you had a partition and a peace that was not what the nationalists wanted. And we had 100 years of irreconcilable conflict over that. So I certainly hope that that doesn't happen. But it's it's an extremely sensitive question.
It's clearly dividing Ukraine right now. We clearly see division within our survey and our interviews, and of course, based on our own experiences, speaking to people. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to conclude on that gloomy thoughts on a gloomy day in Washington. I want to thank our panelists, Garatol and Karina Korostalina, for their very interesting and important work. Please continue to follow the Kennan Institute for future events. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Always pleasure.
Yep,
Thank you very much for hosting us. Thank you.